Hey, praise the Lord, guys. I'm Shaw Greenhorn. But in those days after that tribulation, the sun shall be darkened, and the moon shall not give her light, and the stars of heaven shall fall, and the powers that be in heaven shall be shaken. Then shall they see the Son of Man coming in the clouds with great power and glory. And then he shall send forth his angels, which shall gather his elect from the four winds, from the uttermost parts of earth unto the uttermost parts of heaven. So here we have a continuation of the signs. When the disciples asked, what shall be the sign of thy coming and the sign of these things? This was triggered by the question, when Jesus made well, first of all, they pointed out to him, see us what manner of great buildings and how wonderful these stones are that made the buildings. And Jesus, he pointed it out to them that there shall not be left one stone upon another that shall not be thrown down. So they're asking for the signs for these things first. And then, this kind of led into this whole discussion that he's having with them right now. We've seen him say, take heed lest no man deceive you. First of all, many false Christs shall come. We shall have wars, rumors of wars, nation rising against nation, kingdom against kingdom. There'll be earthquake, famine, pestilence, the beginning of sorrows. You're being beaten in the synagogue, being delivered up to council, appearing before kings and great rulers for my name's sake, taking no thought for what you shall say. For, it is the Holy Ghost that speaketh in you. The brother betraying the brother to death, the father the son, children rising up against their parents, causing them to be put to death. He that endured to the end, the same shall be saved. If any man shall come say, here he is Christ, or lo, he is there, believe him not. Many false Christs, false prophets. So we see really a lot of, false Christs and false prophets arising. And, what started out just as specific, event, the destruction of the temple, this kind of piggybacked onto the manifestation of just as a whole of what life will be like in the last days, the things that's going to be happening, the things to expect. Because there's if this wasn't given, there would be some that would say that it's gonna get better, and there would be some that start pointing out the fact that he is God and he is in control, and they would even go off on their own understanding, saying that it is not his will that we should perish, saying things like he will intercede and he will stop all these things because he is God, and we are his children, and we serve him. But we see here really just a decline in just all mankind, us really being put to the grinder, and to not lead anyone astray. These things were given, the signs, like these are what's going to be happening. So if anyone is preaching anything besides this, or trying to give false comfort or false reassurance, you're not really helping the people, because that's more likely to cause them to walk away. When they see these things come to pass, it might just overwhelm them. They might even feel lied to. How could you lead them astray and tell them to believe all these false things that are not true? But there are those that will stay with God no matter what happens. But we want to prepare the people, and this thing is not going to be pretty. This is real life, and anything will be possible in those days. So he's showing us the raw truth of what is to come. As I said in the previous video, when in the Garden of Eden, when God said, if you touch this or eat of this fruit, you shall die. Us not knowing, well, first of all, what physical death is, the closing of the eyes and going to sleep. Death is also these things, wars and rumors of wars. False Christ coming to deceive many. Did you know that that's one of the consequences of death for us having touched that fruit? Now we have false Christ coming, the destruction of all morality. The brother betraying the brother to death, the father the son, children rising up to against their parents, causing them to be put to death. Sometimes I say that sometimes in life, the consequences that we face for the choices that we make, we're not aware of these things. If you were to be told that, okay, you could pick this thing on the left or that thing on the right. Now mind you, this thing on the left, is going to lead to such and such and such, and this thing on the right, that's going to lead to such and such and such. What we don't realize is that the one that we pick, you see, after the such and such and such, then there's way more other things that go along with it. Some of them happen even years after, way a long time after. And you see, because there's not a immediate cause effect, we don't understand that the things that's happening right now is because of the choice that we made. These consequences that were not disclosed unto us, but just it's just a natural progression of life. And God says what? Be not deceived, that God is not mocked. Whatsoever a man soweth, that shall he reap. And sometimes, as humans, we even lack the insight, the wisdom, and the intuition to connect these things, to know that, well, this is happening because I made this choice when I was younger. I saw this story about this lady that she went into prostitution. She came up from a broken home, and she ended up finding herself in prostitution due to poverty. And she found God along the way, and he cleaned her up. She was in a place of worship. She was in a good environment, And it so happened that she fell in love and she got married. And due to her being in prostitution, she got pregnant, a couple times. I think that there was some damage to her uterus to the point where a viable pregnancy was not something to expect. And now, her husband, I think he might have even known her past, but he didn't know this. And it puts such a strain on the marriage that the husband, he was thinking of walking away because he really wanted children. I mean, there's always surrogates, right? But I mean, maybe they weren't of the income to afford something like that because it's not cheap. But this, choice so long ago, so long ago. She was even a different person. She was in a different environment. But you carry these things with you sometimes. Yeah, I could sit here and give you, examples all day, but just take my word from it for it. That some consequences they follow you. Because like I said, when he told us, you shall surely die in the day in which you touch or eat of this fruit. Here is death. So, here we see some more, really supernatural signs. Who would know that even the stars and the planets, would be affected by the choices and decisions that we make. These prophecies, the ones that he's speaking of now, a lot of them were given in the Old Testament, especially like by Joel. So after that, the tribulation, he just described of the abomination of desolation standing in the place where it ought not. Spoken of by Daniel the prophet, let him that read it understand. It was so bad, they said, let him that is in Judea flee to the mountains. Let him that is on the rooftop not go down into the house, not enter therein, nor take anything from the house. Let not him that is in the field return, not even to the house to take his garment. Pray that your flight be not in the winter. Woe unto them, even that be with child, or those that give suck in those days. If those days shouldn't be shortened, then no flesh should be saved. So, after all of these things, now, that the tribulation, the Bible does speak of a physical tribulation. We know a lot of these things, they have a double meaning. There's the physical, and then there's the spiritual, the more metaphorical thing. The tribulation for God's people is what? Persecution, right? Being made to suffer for what you believe, being excluded, having to take a back seat for other people and their beliefs. The direction that the world chooses to go. When we have to hold on and hold out of these things, and we are made to look at it every day. There's nobody advocating for the believers' rights. They're advocating for the LGBTQ. They advocate for these people that want to live and believe this way. It seems that they love vanity. The tribulation, is them taking prayer out of school. I saw, there was this story. This guy, he wore a T-shirt that said Jesus to the Mall of America, I believe it was. Somebody complained, and they asked him to leave because of what his T-shirt said, Jesus. All it said was Jesus, and he recorded it, then putting him out. Now, this is America, where we have freedom of religion, we have freedom of speech. Where is his right to exercise his religion? Where's his right to exercise his speech? If you have freedom of speech to challenge the very principles of the government, how much more should you have to express, your right, your belief, when you believe in something, like this? I've seen too many, award shows and interviews. As soon as people bring up the name and they start talking, you'll see them lose the feed. The reporter, he'll say, okay, so sorry, we lost them. We'll get back to them in a moment. I even saw one host, he rebuked the person for mentioning the name, saying that there's a time and place for that. Don't bring that in here. Nobody wants to hear that. These things are the spiritual, the more metaphorical tribulation that we're suffering. Being made to take a back seat for our beliefs, having to be mindful of others while no one is mindful of us. In certain countries, they're even persecuted even unto death. So in those days, after that tribulation, the sun shall be darkened and the moon shall not give her light. We've seen this phenomena of the moon being blood, the sun being darkened. We've seen several points in history where this has already happened. But I think it's more useful to point light to the metaphorical meaning. One of the first times we saw the sun be darkened was when Jesus was crucified, right? I believe it was from the 6th to the 9th hour that great darkness fell upon the land. So if we look more at the metaphorical meaning of the sun being darkened, we're in a time where God's people, they're being taken advantage of. They're being hunted down. They're being persecuted. They're being told to take a back seat to what the world believes. They're being told to take a back seat in the direction the world wants to go. And we lose sight of the fact that God is God. We lose sight of the fact that this is his world and that he is in control. We lose sight of the fact that he has a certain way that he expects us to be, to live, to think. We lose sight of the fact of these things. It almost seems as if, when we bring up faith and we bring him up and his name, it's like we're interjecting him, into the atmosphere where he should have been the majority of the thing. I mean, if I was to try and give you a metaphor, I would say, imagine being in a cold room. It's cold during the winter. And then you turn the heater on. Now the heater is blowing warm air in the room, right? And then you see the warm air coming in. Now imagine if the room had been warm with this warm air the whole time. It's kind of like that. So, God, he has lost his place in men's heart for the majority and where the world is headed. All right, can we say that? Can we put that out there? Can we define and say that God has lost his place in men's heart? They'll say his name with their mouth, but when you look at everything that's going on, and he said it, that these people, that their lips, they do honor me with their mouth, praise me with their lips, but their heart is far from me. He's been saying this unto Israel. His very people that he performed all these miracles for. So imagine how much more. And if they could lose sight of him, imagine how much more the world. Who, some of us grew up knowing him, from grandma, grandpa. Some of us, we found him. He found us along the way. But what about everybody else? So this sun being darkened and the moon not giving her light. Understand that it's a mourning that's taking place. The earth is alive. If you read certain Bible verses, you'll see that the earth is alive. The earth is alive. The atmosphere it has its own understanding. When Adam and Eve sinned, what did God say unto Adam? That the ground shall no longer yield unto you her strength. The ground shall not yield unto you her strength. There's another scripture that says that the creature that wait with earnest expectation for the manifestation of the sons of God. Pretty much saying that the earth itself is waiting for us to be manifested, being the sons of God. And if the earth is there waiting, for us to be manifested as the sons of God, and it's, instead, this is what's happening. Can you understand why the sun, being darkened, how this could come about? We've gotten so comfortable in what we see. We've gotten so comfortable in the majority and where everybody else is heading. We forget who's in control. We forget whose world we're living in, that we're just passing through. All these things are his. You can't even consider this to be protest. It's like the son is saying, okay, you're going to deny the creator that made me. I'm gonna deny you. Anywhere you see God today, he had to be interjected there when he should have been there the whole time. Interject something else. Let him be the majority. Like I said, in that cold room, let the room be warm. Let us bring in a little cold. Let us say, okay, it's warm. It's a little even too warm. Let's bring in just a little bit, just a little coldness in the room. Things have gotten so out of hand. We've gotten so used to being lukewarm. We've gotten so used to being cold. Some of us, we're not even lukewarm. We're cold. Now understand that God, He is life. God is strength. God, where the Spirit of the Lord is, there is liberty. In His presence is fullness of joy. What's gonna happen if His presence leaves? You get darkness. He is the light, is He not? The darkness. The Bible says He was the light of men. The light shined in the darkness, and the darkness comprehended it not. How does it look when He doesn't have the majority position where He's supposed to be? We've gotten so used to the way of life that we have gotten so used to the way the world is, that even for us to see God take His rightful place in the hearts of men, it would be foreign to us to see that happen. I remember when I first started, evangelizing. Even some of the scriptures I would read, I could, like, I was ashamed of them. Can't tell you the honest truth. I was ashamed of these scriptures because I know what the world believes. I know what we hold to be true. I know how we think. And looking at these things, it's like I was, having a double heart inside myself. Wanting to be a believer and even aspiring to be a believer, and, being still programmed by the world, the world's expectation. Saying these things, I felt it's like, okay, it's like I was having a double mind. The mind where, okay, I'm in the world. I know that when I go to work, we're going to have conversations about this and this. This is going to be on the agenda. And I could see how the whole day would look. But no, here I am, trying to, minister this word of God, saying all these things. I can see that I had two things in my heart, two things in my mind. And this is me trying to be a believer. Imagine, the rest of the world. They only have one thing, and it's not God. The world, the sun being darkened and the moon shall not give her light, is because we've put God out of it. Even these angels that fell and they left His presence. Do you know what they look like right now? Do you know how malnourished, in their body they are? How malnourished in their minds they are? In their spirit, how malnourished they are? Because they are like plants. Plants need the sun, right? And who was the sun? The Bible literally says in Revelation that in the new world there shall be no need for the sun, for He Himself will be the light of that city. Creation is speaking, the sun being darkened and the moon not giving her light. And it's because of these things. Because you can fool mankind, but you can't fool creation. You can't fool the trees, you can't fool the sun, you can't fool the stars. You can't fool the animals, right? But you can fool mankind though. No, right? And the stars of heaven shall fall, and the powers that be in heaven shall be shaken. A further continuation, nature responding and reacting. The first, time we saw stars falling was, in the beginning, when war broke out in heaven. Michael and his angels fought, the dragon and his angels fought and prevailed not. and there was found no place for them, and they fell to earth. That's the first kind of stars that we see fall. But scientists, they're discovering all kind of things out in space. They're finding new black holes, new phenomena. These things, they're actively happening. Right now we might not be able to see them, and you'll go on your computer. When you open up the search bar and it shows all the news around the world, you'll catch a glimpse of these things happening. They'll have a story here and there. But it does say that, when he returns, that the heavens itself will roll away as a scroll. Imagine the sky just rolling away. And if the sky itself that contains these stars can be rolled away, how much more can these stars, something like this be done to them? This just also shows you just the identity of God. That we know that he is a physical being, because we were made in his image. So he does go upright, and walk like we do. Has a mind to think and make decisions, judge and reason, to know the difference between good and evil. Yeah, he is a physical, like that. But, he's not limited. And, he transcends, that I want to say. These stars falling, what is that communicating about God? What's happening inside of him? That's causing these stars to fall. These questions, I can't give you the answer to them, but I can at least have you thinking. Maybe, I don't know, maybe you can tell me. So the stars of heaven shall fall, and the powers that be in the heavens, shall be shaken. So now, all right, here's something that's easier to explain. We wrestle not against flesh and blood, but against principalities and powers, the rulers of darkness of this world, the spiritual wickedness in where? In high places, right? Powers being shaken. A lot of these beings, they've been corrupted. I've had, God relay, messages to me. And what I can tell you, first of all, the first thing he let me know is that, these powers, that their time is up and it's time for them to be removed. That's the first thing. Their time is up and it's time for them to be removed. You get an understanding that, they've been corrupted. I don't know. At some point they were good and they were doing what they were supposed to. But then how corruption creeps in, right? I mean, I've never seen a minister that didn't start out being on fire for God. I was reading about King Saul, yesterday and today, when he was first elected king. I mean, anointed to be king. We saw where I believe it was the Philistines. They made war against Israel, and he rose to the challenge, and he defended Israel. And before, while he was recruiting his soldiers, the people to help him fight, he went to, I forget what group, people that he went to, Israelites, and they said that they wouldn't help. So after he won the battle, the men were like, okay, so now it's time for us to put these men to death, because when we needed them, they didn't show up. Saul was like, no, the Lord had wrought a great victory in Israel today. No man shall be put to death. It's a time of celebration. But chapters down, we see God send Saul to destroy Amalek, because they actually destroyed the children of Israel while they were, walking through the wilderness coming out of Egypt. And God swore in his wrath, I'm going to wipe them off. I don't want not even the little children, not even the animals to live. Saul went there, he made his own decision. He saved the best of what he could find. God, through Samuel, told him that, listen, I'm going to take the kingdom from you for this. Then we see David enter after David slew Goliath. He got famous with the people. Saul got jealous, wanted to kill him. That's literally why he wanted to kill him. So David, he was on the run, and he went to a priest. And one of Saul's men saw David there, and he came. He accused the priest of treason. He killed this priest and 85 no, I believe it was 85 total. It was out of him, 85 more for 86, or it was 85. That's how many priests Saul slew that day. Going from something like, so you see corruption, and he started out, being so much on fire for God. The powers that be in heaven shall be shaken. These powers, these spiritual wickedness in high places. God, he's emptying these things out, and he's, about to give it unto the new. He told me that he's preparing his children. He's got his people that he's bringing in. But then I asked, weren't these, when they came in, were they not your people? Were they not your children? They got corrupted somewhere along the way. Corruption entered. It comes in very small, right? It finds the smallest way that it can. I've usually seen it where, okay, all right, we're going to ask you to do this one thing, and we're going to pay you. Okay, there's going to be some benefit for you. And that's how it starts. There's always a benefit for you. And, it's a small thing. And, the person, he might say yes. Hopefully he doesn't, right? But then, at this point, it's not something that they need. But then, over time, this gets bigger and bigger. They start asking for more and more. And there comes a point, here's the focus. There comes a point where you go from not needing these things to now them meaning so much to you that it's easier to walk away from your principles than to walk away from these benefits. Now, these benefits, it might be material things. It might be in a position of power. It might be being associated with certain people. You got to play game. You got to play ball with them and do what they want, or else, you lose access, to their benefits, to their red carpets, to their parties, to the spotlight, being in the glim and the glamour. And, power, it takes on a mind of its own. So I can imagine, God having these, and they were faithful at first, but then, when they saw the power, and how, they could control whatever they wanted, they got together. Because, I mean, if you think about it, God telling us what to do, He's powerful, right? But what if we just do whatever we want, then we're powerful. As a matter of fact, we tell him, he doesn't get a say in any of these things. And, power, it feels good. You get to walk with a over, inflated sense of self and ego. You feel powerful. Yeah, it's a good feeling, right? So then powers, shall be shaken out of place. He said that, they've had their time and it's time for them to be removed. So then shall you see the Son of Man coming in the clouds with great power and glory. So now here he is, he's coming, it's time. So then you can, infer that all these things, it was a preparation. It was a selection. It was a shaking up of things to see where we land. Because, people, they can say, things all day to you. But it's not what a person says, it's what they do. And it's who they are. And you can't ask people who they are. You gotta either observe them or you gotta test them. You wanna find out who a person is, you gotta observe them or you gotta test them. You can't ask people who they are. If you, observe Jesus and the Pharisees when he was telling them that, they may clean the outside, inside they're full of dead men's bones. They may broad their phylacteries, hypocrites. They ain't gonna pass land and sea to find one proselyte. When they find him, they make him a twofold child of hell than themselves. It was just back and forth arguing. But when was he able to really, speak to them? Is when he used, metaphors. When he would just say things, in general, these parables. Now, sometimes they did catch on that he was talking about them, and they would be so upset. But a lot of the time, he even got them to give an answer. It was the parable about man that planted a vineyard went into a far country. At the time of the fruit, he sent his servants. They caught some, they beat some, they killed some, they stoned some. And then he asked them, he sent his son, saying that they shall reverence him, but they killed him also. So then he asked them, and it was the scribes and Pharisees that answered, what then shall this Lord of this vineyard do when he returns? And they said, and so rightfully, that he shall destroy these miserable men, and shall give the vineyard out unto other men, other husbandmen that shall render unto him the fruit in their due season. You see how he got them to answer the question, righteously, knowing that it was them he was talking about. So all these things, it was really a proving and a selection process. He says, he that endured to the end, the same shall be saved. If you go to a person, they're only going to tell you the good things about themselves. If they have real insight, they might even tell you some of their strengths and weaknesses. They might even be able to tell you, some disfavorable things, depending on how mature they are. But I guarantee you, he just warned them about false Christs and false prophets shall come in my name and shall, show great signs and wonders. This sign and wonder that he's, about to show, none of them are able to fake that. We know that when Moses went down to Pharaoh to free the children of Israel, most of the things, most of those signs and wonders that he did, the astrologers, they were also able to do most of them, but not all of them. There were some that they could not do. He threw his staff on the ground, it became a serpent. They threw their staffs on the ground and it became serpents also. Imagine being that connected to the devil, because it's the devil that gives this witchcraft power, that they're able to turn staffs into serpents. So he just got done warning them about the false Christ. So here's the sign that you look for, because these false Christs, they come to convince. He's not coming to convince anybody of anything. That's one of the, I think, the biggest signs between him and a false Christ. A false Christ is coming to convince you of things. He's coming in the clouds of heaven with great power and glory, in the glory of the Father with the holy angels. And that's why they come with these, great signs and wonders. They're coming to convince. He's not coming to convince anybody of anything. He's coming to get what's his, and he's out of here. You need signs and wonders to convince everybody that's going to be saying that they are the Christ. He said, if any man come unto you and say, lo, here is Christ, or he is there, well, then what's going to be the next question? Well, how can you prove to me that this is the Christ? And here we go. All right, so I did this. Do you believe now? All right, what if I do this? You believe me now? If I do this, do you believe me? All right, then, okay, what if I show you this? All these things are done to convince you of things. Coming with power and great glory. And he shall send forth his angels, which shall gather his elect from the four winds, from the uttermost parts of earth to the uttermost parts of heaven. He's given many parables, emphasizing this. So now it's the angels that gather us. He comes, every eye shall see him. The Bible speaks of the seal of God. Just as equally as you have the mark of the beast, there is also the seal of God. And this is given by the Holy Ghost. So you understand the difference between him now and a false Christ. His move shall be worldwide. It shall be seen by everyone all at the same time. If somebody has to convince you, like, lo, he is here, or lo, he is there, that means they saw him before you and you still haven't seen him. Now they have to bring you to him. In another translation, it says, well, in another verse, it says, as the lightning shineth from the east unto the west, even so shall the coming of the Son of Man be. So, nobody can go there that's not supposed to be there. You can't, the angels that could be corrupted, the angels that could be bribed, there's not any gonna be any of them left around for you to hitch a ride, where they're going. So they shall gather his elect from the four winds. Know that God, he has people, all over, from all walks of life, all skin color, all countries, walking amongst, all groups of people. He has his people. It says that he shall never, not leave a name for himself. You ever notice how some people that they're just quiet and they have God with them? I remember, going in school. I would observe and notice it that some people they just knew God and they just had him. They weren't loud about it. So like I said, the overall, these scriptures, it points to the signs that cannot be faked. It points to like a winding up of things. The sun being darkened, the moon shall not give her light. Stars fall, the stars of heaven falling, powers being shaken. We're moving it forward, we're pushing it forward. There's gonna be a changing of the guards. There's gonna be a changing of of who's in charge. There's gonna be the manifestation, of all things that we were expecting. And some things they have to be removed. So it's if you ever notice at a job like where there's a 24-hour, like a security, a security, company at a certain time, one shift ends, even with nurses, and the others they come in, and then there's a changing. Those ones they get to go home, and now these ones they start working. All these things, it's pushing forward. It's changing shit. I know. All right, here we go. Now let's do this the right way. I am Straw Greenhorn.